Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Apostate of Mind, where we take a critical and scholarly approach to religion, the Bible claims in particular. I'm Mark Peralta. And just like in Bible studies, you've got like two main camps. You've got those that are the mainstream academics that allow the evidence to dictate their beliefs, their approach to the scriptures. And then you've got evangelical academics that are allowing the Bible to dictate their conclusions. And for a perfect example of that same dynamic, as it relates to the subject of geology in this case, we're going to address a documentary titled Is Genesis History? And for that, I am happy to have Apostate Ann with me. We're going to take a deep dive at some of the claims that are being made in this documentary.
Yes, this movie is called Is Genesis History? And it's a 2017 American Christian film. So it's not put out by a historical organization. And it's promoting creationism. And they're trying to use scientists in different fields to support the creationism idea. So today we're going to be focusing on their first scientist that they bring into the movie, which is Stephen Austin. And I guess we should go ahead and introduce the movie, and then we can get to talking about who this specific scientist is and just explore the claims and address them.
Awesome. We'll say no more.
The Earth, there are a lot of things we need to consider. But one of the most fascinating is the account of the flood. Was the whole earth covered with water? Genesis says the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. So if the flood was truly global, wouldn't there be a lot of evidence?
All right. So yeah, this is one of those areas where geology has to step in a little and be like, wait a minute. The biblical claim is that there was a global flood. It's a huge claim because it would mean that the entire planet was covered in water. And you've got these great elevations throughout the world. And so geology steps in.
Right. And if there was a global flood to that magnitude, there would definitely be evidence. So let's look at the science. I mean, it should be right there, right?
Yeah. And for that, they've chosen Steve Austin, PhD, a geologist. So,
and well, let's dig into who Stephen Austin is first, because, you know, when you're listening to any source, I think it's always important to look at, well, what's their specialty in? What's their background?
Very wise. Yes.
So we have Stephen A. Austin. He does have a PhD, and he's a creationist geology professor. Mm-hmm. Now, I did want to note that he has some articles published. The one mentioned here is from the Journal of Creation. And so I think that's important to note, like, it's not from any credible historic publication.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I've run into a lot of that in archaeology, for example. You've got like mainstream archaeologist academic journals that are serious. And then you've got like these off-brand journals that are not necessarily the same ones.
Right. And if it was science-driven, evidence-based, I mean, why wouldn't scientific publications or geologic publications be publishing this? They should be, if they could demonstrate with evidence their claims. But the only ones that are willing to accept those are ministry-driven publications such as the Journal of Creation. So just that's a little background. And not only that, but Stephen A. Austin serves on the Institute for Creation Research as a scientist. I don't know if he currently does because he's not currently on the roster, but I know at one point he was a senior research scientist. And this was an example of one of his published articles, just to kind of show how not scientific it is Creation Understood by Faith was the title of his article.
Isn't creation understood by faith already?
Only understood by faith.
Only they call it creation.
Yeah.
It presupposes a God that created it.
That's right.
So that's already being understood in terms of faith because there's no evidence of that actually being the case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now that we know a little bit of Dr. Austin's background, we can jump into the video.
When we look at Grand Canyon, we see the inside story to the ground beneath our feet. And we kind of have a layer cake here, don't we, of strata that have been eroded for our benefit to see the inside structure of the Earth. So the ocean is doing some amazing things, and water of incredible power is depositing the layers we see in the canyon.
And are there fossils in all of those layers?
There are marine fossils through all the layers, but the standard explanation is there were 17 different advances and retreats of the ocean over the North American continent, and it was extended over hundreds of millions of years.
He's admitting that there's another standard of belief outside of what he believes. The reason why he's saying that is because the standard he's referring to is that, for example, this is a study looking at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So among that group, only 2% of scientists support the notion of creationism. 98% look at the evidence and have a different conclusion. And so just to bring to light when he's saying the standard, I mean, this is majority are accepting this belief system for good reason, which we'll get into. So really being part of the 2% is representative of more of a fringe belief.
Yeah, 100%. And it's definitely not what's being taught in schools either. I remember I had to take geology twice in college because I got a C in my first semester. And then I'm like, no, I can't have a C. So then I went and took it back and got a B, which was not a whole lot better. But they will never talk about a God making anything or being responsible in any way, shape, or form of anything related to the earth.
And we just visited the Grand Canyon as a family. We just visited the Grand Canyon as a family, and they have a whole exhibit on there describing, how the Grand Canyon formed. And there's lots of good evidence pointing to different rationale that doesn't include a global flood.
Oh, yeah. One of the funny things we encountered was some of these tours that are, being ran by ministries or paraministries. And they've got their own creationist narrative that they're explaining it away to their people that pay them to give them a tour. So it's like this funny thing is like you've got what the people that are like the professionals that work at the park and what the exhibits display on the wall, the visitor center where you read all about it. And then you've got the evangelicals, the Christians that are like preaching their creationist geology.
I've seen that too in museums.
Yeah, they're like the street
don't look
preachers.
at the evidence. Just listen to what I'm telling you. Yeah,
they're the street preachers of the Grand Canyon. They're all over the place. And I think for the viewers, it helps to maybe preface the reason they might be depicting or they're narrowing this about the Grand Canyon. And it's because part of the overall claim of these geologists is that the flood is the cause of the Grand Canyon. So this is an example where they're demonstrating how they believe that the flood is responsible for what they're looking at, these exposed layers of strata that he's defined well. So far, so good. Okay, we're back to the video. Okay.
Yes.
Evidence that you see here that would say that doesn't seem to make sense.
The 4,000 feet flat-lying strata in the canyon are flat. And relative to one another, we look in between the strata layers and we don't see the passage of time in between layers.
You mean erosion?
Erosion, especially, and channeling on any great scale is not visible. And then we look at the strata themselves.
Yeah, that's complete bullocks. That is totally not true. There's so much evidence that talks about like the different layers, and there's a whole study about like the different eras in which each layer was originated from.
Yeah, and how are you going to see what signs of erosion are within the layers if you're just seeing the side of them? And again, as you said, that's not true. In seeing some evidence of channels and
yeah, he just makes this claim that there's no evidence of erosion between the layers, but how could you prove that? Each layer took millions of years, and how much layer thickness was left due to erosion or lack thereof, it's kind of irrelevant. You would never look into that. What you do have between each layer is like differentials in terms of the fossils that are found. And what's interesting is that at the very bottom of all that, like what would have been the initial ocean bottom floor that formed, you've got fossils that are only of species that had lived in those very ancient eras. and consequently thereof. So there's just so much evidence between those layers to prove that this is a very old forming process, that is not some, catastrophic event, which is what they're trying to say. It's the source of all this.
Mm-hmm. And notice in the beginning, he admitted that there were fossils of marine life in every single layer. I don't see how that would be possible if there was a global flood, and that would seem like it would have, like, it's more indicative of time passing slowly versus wiping out a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. If it had been like, experts say that if it had been like this tsunami type of event that just killed everything, and then you've got this layer of fossils all over the place, you would figure that you would have fossils from only one era, number one, and that it would be a mixed bag of everything.
And that it may be species that exist today, like the same species we have today in the same layers, if it was created all at one time.
Right. Species that would be also found, 6,000-7,000 years ago.
Right. Exactly.
Is now predating the flood, supposedly. But that's not the case. What you do have is, stuff from a very long time ago, Mesozoic era stuff. But he's just lying. That's the main point here.
They provide evidence of very rapid sedimentation. Just minutes or hours is all that's needed to make layers.
Well, tell me about the story of these layers. I mean, how did they get here?
In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. My understanding...
See, that's the thing. Like would an actual geologist turn to Genesis for understanding?
No. Yeah, where's the evidence? Where's the geologic evidence pointing to that? No, he's, like you said in the beginning, using the scripture to apply to the science.
Yeah, not to mention
instead of the other way around.
Just like with regards to fossils, you've got also variations with minerals in the sediment. And so each layer is going to be having a different mixture of different things, different elements that are more so a result of whatever the environment at the time where it formed, indicative of. So if the atmosphere was rich in a certain chemical or in a certain gas or whatever, or if there's ash in the air, that's going to be reflected on the composition of each layer. If there was such thing as a global catastrophic tsunami type of event, so you wouldn't expect different layers. You would expect a mixture, a concrete, if you will, of all these things that got destroyed and blazed and pulverized, as they say too, with this magic flood.
Mm-hmm. And we won't even get into the fact that it's saying Noah was 600 years old. Is that what it's saying there?
Yeah.
And supposedly built this giant ark and all the other problems with the flood narrative. But sure, let's try to apply this nonsensical narrative to geology.
Yeah. I would add as well that the Israelites were not the first ones to come up with this global flood idea. The concept of a flood that's as a result of a God that's punishing creation, it was also evident in part of the Sumerian Mesopotamian religions. And they've got myths like the Atrahasis, where there's a globe just like Noah's Ark. And so if for some reason this global flood was proving a God, it's got to be proving the Mesopotamian God first, I would say, rather than the one who...
right, because it predated the Noah story.
100%. That's right, by a long time. But they want to, of course, talk about the Christian God. I'm sure they don't have Marduk in mind.
Right.
As the ocean floor upheaval occurred, some type of magma or earthquake propelled the oceans over the continent.
So that's why we get these marine fossils in.
No. So what the geologist said at the beginning of that short clip was true. There is enough evidence that there was an uplifting of whatever the ocean floor was at the time. But it would have been a process that took millions of years, number one. And then that is simply responsible for the lifting of I think it's called the Colorado Plateau, where the Grand Canyon sits. And so that bit is true.
So there's some lifting, there's some eroding, there's some depositing. It's a lot of things going on.
Right. So far, so good, except on the timing, which most geologists will say took about 10 to 11 million years to
And there's a lot of reason why they believe that.
Yes.
They're not just believing it because a scripture says it.
That's right.
These layers. Yes. And we have 6 months the waters prevailed upon.
So the presence of fossils within the layers is evidence that the type of rock that was forming, in this case, we're talking sedimentary rock predominantly, was forming at the bottom of what would have been an ocean at the time. And so this has to do with an era where pretty much the middle of the United States, across Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, would have been underwater for millions of years, and apparently on and off in different periods as well. And so all that, all the dead fish and dead, even microscopic, marine life would then settle along with all the other sediment that's being deposited millions of years, thus making all that sedimentary rock along the way. But again, this is a very lengthy, slow process.
Good explanation.
On the earth, another 7 months or so for the water to subside. The 4,000 feet of strata probably represents the early and middle part of it.
Probably. That's all.
And
he
it's
has
funny
to
how you
say.
just pointed right back to scripture. I don't know why. It felt kind of awkward.
Yeah, just 7 months later, all this happened. He's just telling the story, but again, not showing any evidence for it.
Yeah.
The global flood right here in Grand Canyon. We have other strata locally in this Grand Canyon region. That's called the Grand Staircase. We have about 10,000 feet, 2 miles thickness of strata on top of the Grand Canyon.
Higher than where we are.
Higher than where we are. And that represents the later stages of the flood and the retreat of the floodwater.
Not necessarily. I don't think that's the position of geologists.
But he said the after part was, 7 months later? So he's trying to say that all that mountain formation was in a 7-month period?
Right, yeah. So I'm getting the clear sense from these people that they believe that the Grand Canyon, what you see there, is essentially done in 2 stages. The floods bring all this sediment that creates the uplifting and all these layers. And then the second part of the flood, where now the waters have stopped from raining and things are receding, that's when it carves out the Grand Canyon.
There's a lot of problems with that.
That's right. And by the way, we are going to get to the bottom of what mainstream geologists say as to how the Grand Canyon was formed, but we're going to let him continue on.
Surface was beveled by retreat of floodwaters. And as
by the retreat of the floodwaters is what beveled the surface. So you have to explain this water carving through all this sedimentary rock, forming everything in a matter of 6 months or less.
Oh, yeah. When we were visiting the Grand Canyon, I remember learning that part of the beveling was kind of like the collapsing of the sand. So like think about whenever you're at the beach and you're building a sandcastle or you're digging, as you're digging deeper, the sides seem to collapse and fall in, and that's how you get the beveling.
Right.
Not necessarily from water pushing through. Is that what he's suggesting?
Yeah, that's what he's suggesting, and he's ignoring what mainstream geologists do say, in that the Grand Canyon is not just one thing that happened, but is more of a complexity of things. And so you have other forms of erosion happening at the same time. So it's not just like the river, but it's like rain, it's snow. Keep in mind that region, it's kind of desert and it gets really cold at night. And so water is likely to freeze. So that causes rock to break. And so, of course, the edges, the right edges of any cliffs begin to wear down. And that takes a long time, but it's part of the process.
Right. We see in California, the mudslides, it's sort of that same effect.
Yep.
The flood retreated into the newly formed ocean basins, then the continents probably uplifted, and the
Probably.
ark, of course, was landed in the high country in the Middle East.
Well, there are some people who say that that record is about a local flood.
I believe it's a global flood, and all the high hills, or the whole heaven, were covered, a universal statement, but that mountains have risen since then. And
So it's interesting how like the skeptic kind of has the right idea in that, in fact, I think most mainstream Bible scholars will say that the narrative about the flood in the Bible is likely referring to local. If it took place, it would have been something local. And I would argue that it would have originated in Mesopotamia, where you do have high flood regions. You've got very strong rivers that are coming together, high flood plain. There's a lot of geology happening right there. Floods in those areas occur all the time. So it makes sense. It doesn't make much sense to me in the land of Judea, which is more of a desertic area, not a lot of raging, rapid rivers, not necessarily high floodplains. I think they just borrowed from these ancient myths and adopted the story. And now these people that have a religious bias in favor of the Bible is 100% inerrant, they're going to justify the Grand Canyon.
Well said. And have you noticed he's said many times, oh, probably this, like he's not asserting it. He doesn't have any evidence to support that. So there's a lot of conjecture here.
That's a great observation on the word. Another word like this that ought to be a red flag or something to look for would be when they say, well, it's not impossible that this would happen.
Yeah.
It's not impossible. And they're only speaking to their audience here, and people that are like confirmation bias, right? They're going to buy that.
They're hanging on to hope. It could still be possible.
Yeah.
Well, sure. Anything's possible, but is it likely? Is that what the evidence is pointing to? That's
right.
the more important question.
we shouldn't measure the depth of the floodwaters by the present mountains of the earth, which are largely created during the flood and after the flood.
Well,
so there is no evidence of that. What he's saying is that all these mountains, like the Himalayas, Colorado Rockies, formed after the flood, and so therefore they don't reflect these high altitudes back when the flood would have taken place. Mm-hmm. Is that what I'm getting here?
Yeah, that's what I understand.
Yeah. So I these mountains just take a very long time to form.
So he's saying, the idea of creationism is that the earth is about 6,000 years old. So he's proposing that all of these mountain formations were in the past 6,000 years, which we know is not the case. The other problem with what they're saying is, from what I understand, there's not enough water on the planet to even be able to cover the tops of the mountains. And let's say that they were a little lower than they were, during this flood time, it still wouldn't be, there's not enough water on the planet to be able to flood everything, even back then.
Yeah. Not to mention the effects that having all that water. So let's suppose that there was, that at some point there was a canopy, as some believe, that held water up above. And so these floodgates opened, and now you've got all this extra water. Like, we've got all that extra water. Scientists have also said that would generate a tremendous amount of energy that would be equivalent to millions of hydrogen bombs.
Whoa.
Because of just the effects of that much mass colliding upon the earth. Like, it would just totally destroy the planet.
Yeah, when you're flooding everything, you're drowning everything, you're killing everything, you would see evidence of that.
Right. Yeah. And that's not the case. And so he's presupposing that maybe when the flood took place, that the earth was very shallow and just very plain all over the place. Like, what evidence would you have of that? Like, that is 100% ridiculous. I think plate tectonics, geology, or whatever, has demonstrated that this is just part of what's occurring in the crust of the earth, of our planet. And it's been going on since who knows when. So the notion that, the planet was just more flat that way, it's ridiculous.
There's so much evidence beyond the aging of the layers that support that the earth is much older than what he's proposing, like the dating of trees. There are trees that are millions of years old. fossils. So there's
so it's not only the animals, the reset of the species, whatever survived in the ark.
Oh yeah, everything
must be responsible.
That's a great point. If everything had drowned and died, that wouldn't explain the biodiversity of species that we have today. You would start all over with life.
Yeah, the cognitive bias is tremendous here.
The fact that we have all of these layers would be unknown to us if we were standing on them, somewhere else, but they're known to us because they've been cut out. How did that happen? Well, it was a story that we all learned in grammar school. Okay, Colorado River over 10.
First of all, why is he poisoning the well by saying that we learned it in grammar school? Like, did you learn about the formation of the Grand Canyon in grammar school?
I don't think so.
Tens of millions of years cut the Grand Canyon. Most geologists have jettisoned that idea. It's hard to sustain a canyon like this for tens of millions of years. You can't imagine a canyon enduring that long with erosion.
No, it's partially true in the sense that our perspective did change. And that perspective was about the uplifting of the plateau. Like, how long did that take? They used to say, or they used to think that it was hundreds of millions of years that it took for the plateau to rise. But nonetheless, the theory that it was the Colorado River, but not just the Colorado River, but other aspects of geology that were involved in the cutting, if you will, of the Grand Canyon. But it's a process that's happening simultaneously. As the plateau rises, the Colorado River and other erosion elements and processes cut down as the plateau is rising up. And so the perspective changed from hundreds of millions of years to perhaps over 10 million years. But it never said, well, the river had nothing to do with it, much less is there evidence that something other than the river, although there are other things that have come up as well, like the role of perhaps other lakes in the surrounding areas. Lakes that would divert course and feed into the Colorado River, and dams that would be created due to volcanic eruptions that then would rupture and then add more destruction. But nonetheless, it's a process that's taking over a long period of time, and it's not due to some global flood.
Yeah, he's trying to say, you were taught this in school, but turns out it's wrong. Well, it's because when better science comes out, when more evidence supports a different theory, the scientific community can change their mindset. Unlike the religious community, they stick to 2,000-year-old plus scripture when there's been many ideas that have changed or evolved, but they stick to tradition, assuming it's true.
Exactly. Yeah.
It would have eventually, the sides would have collapsed and broken down. Then how in the world do we get this all carved out? Well, there are lots of theories, and personally, I like the idea of catastrophic erosion by drainage of lakes. So after the flood, we have these large bodies of water, these lakes that are trapped. There's evidence of the big lake in the Painted Desert, a place called Hopi Buttes, about 500 cubic miles of water in this huge lake. And so the dam breaks, and all of that massive amount of water then is now pouring out and carving this. Yes. And how long would it take to erode Grand Canyon? Maybe weeks, but not.
Wait, so was it a flood or was it these leftover lakes?
Well, why would it take just weeks?
And that's the thing. Like, indeed, there are these lakes that are responsible, I would say, partly with what you see there to some extent. But for the majority, I mean, the 4,000 elevation cut, if you will, that's something that took over a long, long period of time. And he just saying the 6 months, whatever, because that's what his Bible says.
Right. You can't say that erosion from the lake overflow happened in a very short amount of time. There's no evidence to support that.
What I think he's doing is just like, he's just acknowledging this is something that we need to account, that we can't deny it. And so why not just include it as part of the flood narrative, which there's no mention of these lakes in Genesis. So no.
millions of years. Time is not a magic wand that solves all the geologic problems of the world. Jettison that way of thinking about millions of years and then start thinking about catastrophic process like you.
See, I hate the way he puts it because, to describe time like this magic thing, it sounds like he's just strawmanning, the very fact that geologists say and they have evidence to demonstrate that this process took over a long period of time. And so time is a factor, which in your case, Mr. Scientist, it contradicts your biblical chronology, and that is your problem. But all the evidence points that this took place over a long period of time, not just the carving out, if you will, of the canyon, but the forming of these layers, wrong in both directions.
Help you understand Grand Canyon.
Everywhere we looked, Steve showed me evidence of the incredible power of moving water. It quickly laid down these enormous layers, then quickly eroded them away. Steve wanted to show me where the floodwaters first hit the continent, so he took me deeper into the canyon. Steve, when you said you were going to bring me to the bottom, you weren't kidding, were you? We're at the bottom, aren't we?
So we're in this big side canyon to the main Grand Canyon, and we're looking at the granite basement rock, which is the core of the continent, if you will. And then we see the flat-lying strata on top of it. The boundary between the granite rock below and the Tapete sandstone above is this surface we call the Great Unconformity.
Why does it appear to be such a stark line? I mean, it's clear.
I think it's an erosional boundary of colossal scale. We're looking at something that shows the magnitude of flood flow over a surface.
And is it just here?
This is not true, though. I mean, it is true that there's such thing as the Great Unconformity, but what is not is evidence of this massive flood going through, ripping everything apart, and then forming everything back down. What geologists believe is that this Great Unconformity, what it is evidence of a change in perhaps a period where there was no formation of sedimentary rock because it would not have been under ocean water. And what you've got there is layers of granite, which is metamorphic rock, which forms well deep underneath. And so what happens is that as the plateau is rising, is also bringing up these layers of metamorphic rock that had formed deep underneath, and it brought them up. And then the layers above the unconformity are made of different rock. These are sedimentary rock now forming underwater. And so that's all it is. It's evidence of a change, but it's definitely not evidence of a global flood.
The Great Unconformity is continent-wide. I've seen it, I believe, in the Middle East. It's over in Europe. It's in Africa. And here it is under the North American continent. So,
yeah, the reason why that is because just like it occurred in the Grand Canyon, it's likely to have occurred in other areas of the planet. I mean, that's just very basic concept of geology. Nothing to be surprised about.
We've got this layer. How thick is this layer? What goes up from here?
Well, we have the Sauk mega sequence here, if you will, 1,000 feet of sandstone, shale, limestone that goes continent-wide. There are 4 other big sequence packages of strata that sit above it.
Notice how he mentioned that there are different layers of sedimentary rock. You've got limestone, and then you've got shale. And the reason why you have those different types of rocks is indicative of the geology that was on the surface when those things occurred, So if there were times where the ocean shores shifted around, as oceans do tend to shift, then they're going to be composed of different, more, think of shell, there's going to be more marine life and other things.
Yeah, like when we visit beaches, they have different color sand, different texture sand based on the life.
That's right. And then those different strata are indicative of different periods that were different, that were the ocean floor or lack of ocean floor, a clay area. So think of an ocean drying up and then it's very clayey, right? And then it dries up. There's evidence of mud cracks in between the layers. And it doesn't, I mean, you cannot have these things forming in a matter of 6 months in between, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the different layers actually refute this hypothesis that a flood formed it.
Those are also very continuous like this. What we're seeing here is rather representative of the rest of the world.
It makes one really question the notion that this all happened because of a small local flood. We're talking about something enormous.
The power-moving water was beveling and pulverizing rock, depositing great thicknesses of layers and calling our minds to think about a global flood.
So there it is right there. If it was like they claim that this catastrophic tsunami came and pulverized rock from all over the world, forming these layers, right? You would expect not to have these strata. You would expect to have a mixture of all these different sediments without any regard. I mean, it's a catastrophic event. It's a mixture of things, right? It becomes essentially a swamp of dead animals and sediment all over. That settles into the crust, and there should be evidence of that, but that's absolutely not the case.
That's a great point. Instead of seeing the layers that we do see, it may look like a big, huge layer of all the same.
Yeah, like concrete or something, a mixture of all these things.
The conventional story is entirely different, though. It would say that there is a lot of time between each of these layers.
Some people have said that the great unconformity boundary here represents 500 million years.
You mean between the granite we see in that first layer of the sedimentary rock?
Yeah, they say that there may be 500 million years there. Okay, and that's what their explanation of Earth history would ask them to consider.
That's what the evidence points to. And he even said the standard belief is this. So he's agreeing that what he believes is not the standard belief. But yeah,
I mean, he kind of mumbles to me, he's like, well, this is like, widely accepted. And it contradicts Bible chronology, by the way, because Bible chronology said, God created the world 6,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So that right there should have been enough for you to turn around and be like, maybe I should not be doing geology through the lens of my Bible.
Here, and look at this, nearly a featureless plain. It's not exactly a plain, but it's a gently rolling surface. And would that be the product of billions of years? Or would that be the product of the power of water?
No, that's 100% ridiculous. That is, in fact, granite rock that you're looking at, the bottom part of the great unconformity. So the great unconformity of the space in between tons of sedimentary rock layers and out of nowhere layer of metamorphic rock. In this case is granite. And so that is rock that is made naturally over millions of years deep underneath the crust, not something as a result of any flood by any means.
Planing off a surface. Time is foreign to a good explanation here. And so we want to explain what we see. Everywhere we look, we see the power of water. And it's water on a colossal scale, and that's the story here in Grand Canyon. It's not a little water and a lot of time. It's a lot of water and a little time.
And no evidence to support that it was due to a little bit of time. I mean, all the evidence that we have is supporting that it is a great amount of time. And he even admitted this is the standard belief for good reason. So let's get into those reasons.
All right, folks. So we are starting a new series where we are addressing this documentary, but we didn't just want to leave you with just our reactions to this video. We do want to share with you what, number one, we want to talk about like what is the mainstream view of how the Grand Canyon was formed. And then number two, I'm going to highlight for you much of the work of Lawrence G. Collins, who is a geologist that has written extensively on the matter, specifically here refuting the possibility that a global flood took place that formed the Grand Canyon and his reasons why.
Oh, great. First, let's really understand what the mainstream understanding is about how the Grand Canyon formed. So, this is a quick overview. The Grand Canyon records nearly 2 billion years of Earth's history. This history began in the Precambrian era with
So that is overall the mainstream perspective by most geologists that are not using the Bible as their bias towards their findings. And I don't know about you, but this certainly doesn't sound like some sort of flood narrative.
Exactly. Looking at the evidence that we saw, and I think what we're going to describe, I think this explanation makes a lot of sense and is what the evidence is seemingly pointing to.
Okay, so now we're going to get to the 20 reasons why.
So, one thing that Dr. Austin didn't do was to explore all of the reasons why the creation narrative doesn't make sense. So, here are 20 reasons why, using evidence from the Grand Canyon, why the creation story can't be true. Number one, limestone and sandstone are present in the Grand Canyon, which take a long time to harden. And if they didn't have that time to harden, they would have slumped and caved over. So it couldn't have been a short amount of time. Number two, the salt and gypsum deposits are up to 3,000 feet thick. That takes a lot of time. And so that wouldn't have been able to form in a short amount of time. Number three, the Zion National Park has evidence of desert during the time of the flood. If the floodwaters had covered everything, there wouldn't have been a desert during that time. Number four, mud cracks in the Cambrian Tapiats Formation suggest drying conditions during the start of Noah's flood time. So this again shows that there was dry conditions during a supposed flood. Can't be the case. Number five, there's evidence of raindrop imprints that would have been during the time that there was a flood. And you can't have raindrop imprints on top of water or on the bottom of the ocean. It had to have been dry land. Number six, dinosaur egg nests have been discovered in various locations across the globe, but it seems unlikely that these creatures could have built them and laid their eggs while supposedly fleeing from the floods to seek safety on higher lands. Number seven, the White Cliffs of Dover in England, so I guess this is now outside of the Grand Canyon, have layers of chalk that are 350 feet thick. And we know that this contains layers of coccoliths, which is a type of algae that is fossilized over time, and that's what creates chalk. So it would have taken a lot of time for chalk to form, being that it's made by this fossilized algae, and it would have taken time that the creation narrative doesn't provide. 8, there's a tiny marine organism called radiolarians, and they're made of chloroplasts, and there's layers in the Pacific Ocean floor that are 4,590 feet thick. These creatures depend on sunlight to survive. And so they couldn't have been at the bottom of the ocean. They had to have been exposed to the sun. So it couldn't have been during the flood. Number 9, despite the presence of sedimentary rocks in the Grand Canyon, there's no traces of pollen and grains and spores of algae and pines and flowering trees and plants. If there was a great flood, you would see the species of plant life in the geologic record. Number 10, the Grand Canyon red wall limestone contains countless sea lily fossils. Again, this would have taken lots of time, much more than a year's time that they're proposing. Number 11, if all limestone was deposited by Noah's flood, they would show evidence of, jumbled fossils and rushing water, but you don't. You see consistent thickness and lack of jumbled fossils, for example, in the Silurian limestone layers. So it indicates a slow chemical process. Number 12, charcoal. Charcoal we know is caused by extreme heat, fire. Well, you can't have fire underwater. Number 13, Colorado River Canyon walls contain river terraces aging from 38,000 to 350,000 years old. So the aging of the terraces by different methods, and they're much older than the 4,500 years that creationists claim that the sedimentary rocks would have been formed after Noah's flood. Number 14, based on scientific observations and measurements, it's been determined that the canyon of the Colorado River was eroded at varying rates. So some parts 80 to 558 meters per million years in different areas of the canyon. So there's not a consistency of this, one great flood. Number 15, the granite. As Mark talked about earlier, the granite takes a long time in extreme conditions of hot and cold and pressure to form. And so this granite being there tells us a story of a lot of time and extreme temperatures. So not consistent with a global flood, or not consistent with the aging of the Earth as proposed by creationists. Number 16, the granite in the floor of the Colorado River erodes at a rate of about 1,000th of an inch per year. So you can look at the erosion and age the granite, and it suggests that it would have taken millions of years rather than just one sudden catastrophic event. So even as powerful as they're suggesting the water is, the amount of power, the amount of time still doesn't match up to their timeline. The only reason why they're proposing that timeline is because the Bible says so, not because of any evidence supporting that. Number 17, the average thickness of sedimentary rocks around the world deposited by Noah's flood is about 1,800 meters. Even if just 1% of this thickness contained fossil remains of marine animals alive at that time, the whole world would have been covered with 59 feet of these animals. It's not possible. It takes a lot of time for the layers of fossils to accumulate. Number 18, according to an experiment by Charles Monroe, submerging an olive tree underwater for 3 months would kill it. And that's the more generous side of the Genesis story. We know there's a Genesis story that says that the flood lasted a year. So if you're going on the more generous side and saying, okay, maybe it was only 3 months, the olive tree wouldn't survive. So that doesn't corroborate the story of after the flood, the dove coming and bringing an olive branch. The olive tree would have been dead if it was submerged underwater. Number 19, the theory that a tsunami created the erosion surface beneath the Cambrian Chapiate sandstone, which sits atop of the Precambrian basement that forms the unconformity that we talked about in the Grand Canyon, lacks scientific plausibility. The theory of a tsunami creating that, the great unconformity that we talked about is not mentioned in the Bible. And so not only is it not supported by science, but also not biblical. And number 20, if the sedimentary rocks of the Grand Canyon were deposited by a worldwide flood, then there should be some evidence of continuous deposition within a year and no disruptions between formations. So it'd be like almost one giant layer of similar species, similar things all mixed together instead of, a layer of certain species and then a layer of another species and a layer of another species. That really tells us a story of time and life and geologic changes. So there you have it. 20 reasons of evidence why the global flood story is not true.
At least 20 scientific, very geeky reasons why geologists all across the globe reject the notion that a global flood, a global tsunami sent by Yahweh was the cause of the Grand Canyon, and how it's just simply scientifically unfeasible to believe it to be so.
This concludes part 1 of our series that we're starting of This Movie is Genesis History. And we plan on taking each scientist and taking their claims and putting it to the test and seeing what the evidence points to. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
And until next time, folks, this has been Apostate
of Mind.